In a bustling first-class cabin, tension sparks the moment a flight attendant singles out a black passenger. The arrogance of power clashes with calm dignity as a symbolic act of disrespect shocks everyone. But the man's quiet words leave the air heavy, and his presence hints at a truth no one yet realizes. We don't seat people like you in first class. The words cut through the soft murmur of boarding passengers like a shard of glass snapping in a quiet room. Heads turned. Some froze mid-step in the aisle. Others pretended to look away, fiddling with their phones, their magazines, their carry-ons, anything, to avoid acknowledging the ugliness they had just heard. The setting was the polished, hushed luxury of the airline's first-class cabin, the crown jewel of their service. Champagne flutes gleaming on the tray, the faint scent of citrus polish on leather seats, and the low hum of engines waiting to roar. A place built to whisper of money, exclusivity, status. A place where silence itself felt expensive. And yet, in the center aisle, silence was broken by arrogance. The flight attendant stood stiff, her crisp uniform a little too tight at the collar. Her chin tilted upward with authority she thought was hers to wield. She gestured at the seat near the window 1-2 occupied by a tall, broad-shouldered black man in a tailored charcoal suit. His presence radiated quiet confidence, but his stillness was not submission. It was observation. Behind them, a middle-aged white man cleared his throat impatiently. His Rolex caught the cabin lights as he adjusted the cuff of his sleeve. His face was flushed, not from embarrassment but from expectation. His eyes darted from the attendant to the man in the seat as if to say, "Handle this. Quickly." The attendant's tone sharpened. "Sir, this seat is reserved. You'll need to move to economy. Now." The man didn't flinch. He let the words hang there, as if giving them enough rope to strangle themselves. His gaze swept the cabin, the business travelers shifting uncomfortably, the younger passengers peeking over the tops of their laptops, and the silent chorus of privilege that thrived best when it didn't have to speak. Slowly, deliberately, he placed his boarding pass on the tray beside him. Its bold black letters screamed the truth. First Class 1-2A. But the attendant didn't look. Instead, she reached for the pass, snatched it with a flick of disdain, and without even scanning it, tore the stub clean in half. The paper snapped, with a sound that echoed louder than the jet engines warming outside. A symbolic act. A quiet humiliation. A message. The man's jaw tightened, but his eyes didn't waver. He adjusted the cuff of his suit, straightened his tie, and finally spoke. "Do you know what power looks like?" His voice was low, even. It carried more weight than volume. The attendant blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" "Power," he repeated, calm and measured, his eyes fixed on hers. "It isn't loud. It isn't desperate. It doesn't need to tear paper to prove itself." For a split second, something faltered in her gaze. The passengers nearby leaned in, not because they wanted to, but because they couldn't help it. The quiet confidence in his tone demanded attention. Then he leaned back in his seat, folding his hands in his lap with elegance that mocked her arrogance. "I'll stay right here," he said simply. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating, daring someone to break it. The impatient white man shifted, muttering under his breath about delays, his entitlement burning red across his cheeks. The attendant, lips pressed thin, clutched the torn boarding pass like a weapon she didn't know how to use anymore. Then he smiled, not wide, not smug. Just a small, knowing curve of his lips. "You'll regret this moment," he said softly, the words cutting sharper than any shout could. Something in the air shifted. The attendant's eyes darted around the cabin as if seeking support, but found none. Passengers avoided her gaze. Some lowered their eyes, ashamed. Others stared at him, curious now, sensing the weight of his presence. It was then In that charged silence, that the first tremor of revelation crept in, not spoken, not announced, just lingering like a storm cloud at the edge of the horizon, because this man, calm in his seat, wasn't simply a passenger. And when the truth of who he was surfaced, it wouldn't just shake her. It would shake the airline to its foundation. "Ma'am, why is there a delay?" The question came from 2 rows back, a young woman in a business suit tapping her watch impatiently. Her tone wasn't cruel, just anxious, but the ripple of frustration she voiced stirred the already charged air. The flight attendant swallowed hard. Her authority was slipping. She could feel it, the way the cabin eyes clung to her movements, to the tremor in her hand still clutching the torn boarding pass. It was supposed to be simple. Escort the man out, smooth things over, restore order. But the simplicity had dissolved the moment he refused to move. The white man behind him, broad, red-faced, clutching his designer briefcase, leaned forward. His voice carried like a gavel slamming down. "You heard her. You don't belong here. Get back to where you came from." A hush fell over the cabin. The words were meant to humiliate, to stamp superiority like a boot on the floor. But the silence afterward betrayed something else: discomfort, guilt, even shame among the onlookers. People shifted, pretended to read, scrolled through phones with blank eyes, desperate to avoid being drawn into the ugliness. The man in the charcoal suit remained still. He didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge the insult as though it were beneath the reach of his attention. Instead, his eyes studied the glass of champagne on the armrest beside him. Its surface trembled faintly, catching the glow of overhead lights. Calmly, he lifted it, swirled the liquid, and placed it back on the tray table with a precision that mocked the chaos around him. His symbolic answer to arrogance, serenity. Then his gaze rose to the flight attendant. "You've already made your choice," he said softly, almost kindly. "Now the cabin is watching to see how far you'll take it." The attendant stiffened, color flooding her cheeks. She glanced around, but found no allies. Even the co-attendant by the galley had turned away, busying herself with the safety car demonstration kit. Silence pressed harder against her ribs. Then the man's words. "Sir," she said sharply, regaining her voice, "you need to step out so we can resolve this." He leaned back in his seat, folding one leg over the other. "Resolve it?" His tone was amused now. "You've already resolved it. You've torn my boarding pass. You've announced I don't belong. You've given this gentleman," he gestured lazily toward the white man behind him, "permission to voice what he really thinks. What more resolution could you want?" The businessman flushed deeper. "Don't you twist this around. I paid for this seat." "So did I," the man interrupted, his voice even, but so firm it cut through like steel. The businessman faltered, mouth opening then closing. The cabin grew heavier. A woman across the aisle reached for her husband's hand. The teenager with earbuds lowered his music, curiosity blooming in his wide eyes. Even the anxious businesswoman with the watch had stopped fidgeting. Every soul in that cabin was watching. Not just a confrontation, a performance, a mirror, a reckoning they didn't sign up for but couldn't escape. The attendant straightened her posture, clinging to protocol like a lifeline. "If you refuse to comply, we'll have to remove you from this flight." Finally, the man turned his head toward her, his eyes catching the light. They weren't angry, but they were steady, unshakable, almost regal in their calmness. "Do what you must," he said. "But remember, every action carries a price, and some prices are higher than you can imagine." His words lingered, heavy, ominous, and strangely prophetic. The attendant froze. Something in his tone unsettled her more than defiance. It wasn't the anger of someone who had lost. It was the confidence of someone who already knew how this would end behind them. The businessman tried to laugh, forced and brittle. "Empty threats. He's bluffing." People like him don't have power. The man didn't even turn. His lips curved in that same faint, knowing smile from before. A smile that said, "You'll see." And in that moment, the cabin realized something the attendant and businessman didn't. This man wasn't afraid of being removed. He wasn't clinging to the seat out of pride or desperation. He was letting them build their own noose, strand by strand, arrogance by arrogance, until it would tighten not around his neck, but theirs. The silence of the passengers grew thicker, electric, almost unbearable. The unspoken question hung in the air. Who is he? The attendant stepped back, muttering something about contacting the captain. Her heels clicked against the carpet as she walked briskly toward the cockpit, clutching the torn boarding pass like evidence. The businessman smirked in shallow victory. "There, finally, you'll be gone in minutes." But the man in the suit didn't move. He didn't argue. He didn't even look back. He simply whispered, almost to himself, but loud enough for those nearby to hear, "The higher the ticket, the greater the fall." Passengers exchanged glances, puzzled but intrigued. His words didn't make sense yet, but they felt like prophecy, like a warning no one understood yet. And just like that, the cabin was no longer simply a cabin. It was a theater, a courtroom without walls. An audience waiting for the truth to take the stage. The cockpit door clicked open, and for a moment the cabin seemed to hold its breath. The captain emerged tall, graying at the temples, his crisp uniform pressed with military precision. His very walk carried the weight of authority, the silent assurance that he was the ultimate decision-maker at 30,000 feet. Behind him trailed the flight attendant, her face tight with victory, as though she'd summoned a higher power to deliver judgment. She clutched the torn boarding pass like a warrant. The captain's eyes swept the cabin with quick, practiced efficiency. He noticed the whispers, the frozen passengers, the businessman puffed up in self-satisfaction, and then finally him. Black man sat calmly in seat 12A, one ankle crossed neatly over the other, his hands resting lightly in his lap. He didn't rise, didn't fidget, didn't even blink as the captain stopped at his row. "Sir," the captain said evenly, "I'm told there's been an issue regarding your seating assignment." The man's eyes lifted to meet his, calm, unflinching, the kind of gaze that seemed to measure not just the words spoken, but the weight behind them. "No," the man replied softly, "there's no issue with my seat." The captain's brow creased. "Then why is there a complaint?" The man tilted his head slightly toward the flight attendant. "Because she decided my presence here was inconvenient." A ripple of murmurs spread through the nearby passengers. The businessman behind him leaned forward, eager to interject. "Captain, he's lying. That seat is mine." "He's in the wrong class." The captain held up a hand to silence him. Then he turned to the attendant. "May I see the passenger manifest?" She hesitated. Her grip on the torn boarding pass tightened. This was his ticket. He was seated incorrectly. The captain frowned, taking the torn slip from her. His eyes scanned the bold black letters that still clung to the stub. First Class 12A. For the briefest second, something flickered across his face, hesitation, maybe doubt, but it was gone in an instant. His jaw tightened. "Even so," he said slowly, "I'll need you to come with me, sir, so we can sort this out." The man remained seated. "Is that your order?" The captain straightened. "It's a request. For now." Passengers leaned in closer. The businesswoman with the watch bit her lip. The teenager with earbuds pulled them out completely, his wide eyes fixed on the scene. Everyone felt it, the strange imbalance of power colliding with dignity that refused to bend. The man leaned back, resting his hands on the armrests. "Captain," he said, his voice low and resonant, "authority is not the same as justice. You may command this aircraft, but you do not command my place in this seat." The captain's lips pressed thin. He wasn't accustomed to defiance. Not here, not in this domain where his word was law. The murmurs of passengers only fed his unease, turning a simple request into a public trial. The businessman, impatient, barked, "Why are we wasting time? Just drag him out." The words cut through the air like a whip. A few passengers gasped. Others shifted uncomfortably. The ugliness had spilled out too far now to be hidden. And then, in a gesture as deliberate as it was symbolic, the man in 1-2 reached for the glass of champagne again. He raised it slowly, eyes locked on the captain. And with deliberate calm, he took a sip. The cabin stilled. The act was quiet rebellion, a declaration. I am not moving. Not for you. Not for anyone. When he set the glass down, he spoke again, his tone even, almost conversational. You asked me to leave my seat, yet you haven't asked the man behind. Emmy to prove his claim. Why is that? The captain's jaw tightened. Because she, he gestured toward the attendant, verified it. By tearing my ticket? The man's voice sharpened now, slicing into the silence. That's your verification? A shred of paper in her hand against the truth printed in bold letters? The captain opened his mouth, but no words came. For the first time, authority wavered. The businessman tried to laugh again, but it came. Out brittle, cracking under the weight of the moment. Don't listen to him, Captain. He's just... The man turned his head, his eyes like steel now. Just what? The businessman faltered. The words stuck in his throat. His face flushed crimson, but he said nothing. The man leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper, though every passenger heard it. The question isn't whether I belong here. The question is whether you can live with what happens when the truth comes out. The words slid into the air like a prophecy, chilling, heavy, undeniable. The cabin shifted again, passengers exchanging nervous glances. The attendant's hands trembled slightly, still clutching the paper. The captain exhaled slowly, as though realizing this was no longer a matter of seating. This was something larger. Something heavier. And the man in 1-2 sat in the middle of it all, calm, dignified, unmovable. The hum of the engines filled the air like a steady drumbeat, but inside the cabin, it felt like silence had teeth. It gnawed at every corner, every row, every heart that dared to keep its eyes forward. The captain stood in the aisle, his uniform crisp, but his authority fraying thread by thread. The flight attendant hovered behind him, still gripping the torn boarding pass, her fingers clammy, her smile forced into a brittle line. And the businessman, red-faced, fuming, shifted in his seat as though the leather itself burned against his entitlement. Yet the man in 1-2 remained utterly still. His calmness unsettled everyone more than rage ever could. Passengers whispered now, voices low but sharp. Why don't they just check the system? He has the right ticket. Why's that other guy acting like he owns the plane? The murmurs rippled like a tide, breaking the silence into fragments of truth. But no one spoke loud enough for the captain to hear clearly. It was easier to let injustice bloom quietly than to confront it openly. The businessman couldn't stand it. He slammed his hand on the armrest, startling those nearby. Are we seriously still discussing this? He doesn't belong here. This is first class. Not, he stopped himself, but the unsaid word hung in the air, poisonous and unmistakable. The captain shot him a warning look, but the damage was done. The passengers stiffened, some gasping softly, others sinking deeper into their seats as if silence could shield them from complicity. The man in 1-2 finally turned his head, his gaze sweeping across the faces around him. His eyes weren't angry. They were searching, measuring. Each passenger felt it like a spotlight grazing their conscience. He spoke at last, his voice low, steady, each syllable deliberate. Do you hear yourselves? You sit in silence while arrogance spits in your faces. You whisper truth into your laps but won't raise it into the air. A hush fell again, heavy, suffocating. Some averted their eyes. Others stared back, caught between shame and admiration. Captain cleared his throat, trying to reclaim authority. "Sir, please. This isn't the place for speeches. I need you to cooperate so we can take off." The man tilted his head slightly, as though amused by the irony. Cooperate? Cooperation isn't silence in the face of humiliation. Cooperation is truth, and the truth is written on that torn boarding pass you refuse to see. His words cut deeper than any raised voice could. The attendant shifted uneasily, her grip loosening on the paper, its torn edges trembling in her hand. For a moment, she looked as though she might speak, might confess, but the businessman's glare bore into her like a command. He leaned forward again, his voice sharp, trembling with fury. "Why are you all staring at him like he's some kind of martyr? He's just a passenger. He doesn't matter." This time, the man turned fully to face him. The air thickened, passengers holding their breath as their eyes locked. "Be careful," the man said softly, almost like a warning whispered through smoke. "The moment you decide who matters and who doesn't, you reveal more about yourself than you ever intended." The businessman's face contorted, his arrogance curdling into something uglier. He opened his mouth, but the words tangled in his throat. He turned instead to the captain, demanding, "Are you going to let him talk to me like that? Are you the captain or not?" The captain inhaled sharply. His authority was a mask cracking under pressure. He knew the passengers were watching not just the man in 128 but him, his decision, his silence, his fairness or lack of it. But before he could respond, a small voice broke through the cabin. "Why are they treating him like that?" It was a child, a boy no older than 8, seated 2 rows ahead. His wide eyes peered over the seat back at the scene, innocence wrapped in confusion. His mother shushed him quickly, pulling him close, whispering something soothing. But the question hung in the air like smoke no one could fan away. The man in 12 amperes smiled faintly at the boy, a smile that was both tender and knowing. Then he looked back at the captain. Children see truth more clearly than adults. "That's the weight of your silence, Captain. Even he feels it." The captain's face flushed. His posture stiffened, his hand tightening on the clipboard at his side. Authority was slipping, and he could feel the cabin shifting against him. Attendant looked down at the torn boarding pass again. For the first time, her lips parted as though to speak, but then she stopped herself, swallowing the words. She wasn't ready. "Not yet." The man leaned back into his seat once more, folding his hands together, his presence unshakable. "Every second you delay this flight, every word you let him speak, every torn paper you clutch, it all writes a story. A story the world will hear." Passengers exchanged nervous glances. His words didn't sound like threat. They sounded like prophecy. The businessman sneered, trying to fill the silence again. "You don't scare me. You're nothing. Just wait until security drags you out." The man's faint smile returned, calm and cutting. "When the truth lands, you'll wish it were only security." The words hung in the air like thunder before a storm dot, and for the first time, the captain felt it too. The weight of silence. The sense that the man in 12A wasn't simply defying them, he was preparing them. The engines outside roared, a reminder that time was slipping. The aircraft was cleared for takeoff, but inside, the cabin was still trapped in a storm that had nothing to do with weather. The captain's hand hovered near his radio. A single call and ground security would be waiting at the gate. He could end this. But his instincts told him this was no ordinary passenger, and this was no ordinary defiance. "Sir," he said again, voice firmer now, "you need to cooperate so we can continue the flight." The man in 12A did not move. His fingers tapped lightly against the armrest, a slow rhythm that felt like a clock counting down. Cooperation is a two-way street, Captain. You don't ask a man to walk it blindfolded. The words seemed simple, but they lodged in the minds of everyone listening. The businesswoman with the watch bit her lip harder. The teenager leaned forward, earbuds forgotten in his lap. Even the child who had spoken earlier peeked over his mother's shoulder again, eyes wide with questions. The businessman behind him couldn't stand the silence. He shot up half out of his seat, his voice cracking like thunder. Enough of this. He's holding all of us hostage with his little act. Remove him now. The cabin jolted. Hostage. The word was ugly, explosive, and it hung in the air like smoke. The man in 1-2A turned his head slowly, his eyes locking on the businessman. Hostage? His voice was steady, but sharper now. You think my quiet defiance is a chain around your neck? No, it's your arrogance that shackles you. A murmur rippled through the rows. Passengers exchanged glances, whispering louder. Now, the balance was shifting. The businessman could feel it, and his fury only deepened. Don't you listen to him, he barked at the captain. He's manipulating all of you. He doesn't belong here. People like him never do. There. It was, the words everyone had been skirting around. Blunt, undeniable, dripping with the stench of prejudice. The man in 1-2A didn't flinch. He reached down, picked up the torn boarding pass from where the attendant had dropped it onto the tray, and held it up for everyone to see. The two halves trembled slightly between his fingers, fragile but still legible. This, he said, his voice carrying through the cabin, is what prejudice looks like. Torn, but still true. Broken, but undeniable. He set the paper down carefully on the armrest, smoothing the edges together as if restoring its dignity. The symbolic action struck deeper than any argument could. Passengers inhaled sharply. Some nodded ever so slightly, emboldened by his quiet courage. The captain's throat tightened. His authority was slipping, but he also felt something else: shame. Shame at letting this unfold under his watch. Shame at the child's question still echoing in his ears. Why are they treating him like that? The attendant looked pale now, her eyes darting everywhere but the man in 1-2A. The torn ticket haunted her, its edges whispering of her mistake. She wanted to melt into the floor, but the businessman's glare pinned her upright like a puppet. The silence fractured again when an older gentleman near the front spoke. His voice was calm, but carried weight. Captain, with respect, I've flown with this airline for 30 years. If his ticket says first class, then he belongs in first class. End of discussion. Heads turned. The businessman's face darkened. Stay out of this. You don't know. I know what fairness looks like, the man interrupted, his tone firm. And I know what this looks like. The cabin shifted. The whispering grew louder. It was no longer just observation, it was awakening. The captain closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. His voice wavered as he spoke. Sir, please, let's move this outside the plane. For everyone's sake. The man in 12 amperes smiled faintly, a smile that was calm but laced with something heavier certainty. For everyone's sake, Captain, I'll stay right where I am. Because the truth doesn't get moved to the back of the plane. The words rang through the cabin, sharp and undeniable. A few passengers clapped softly before stopping themselves, realizing the tension was too raw. But the point had been made. The businessman growled, slamming his fist on his tray table. You'll regret this. You think you're making some kind of stand? You're just embarrassing yourself. The man didn't even look at him. Instead, he reached for the champagne glass again, lifting it slowly, deliberately, as if to toast. His voice was almost a whisper, but it carried across the aisle. No, sir, I'm not embarrassing myself. I'm reminding you what dignity looks like. He set the glass down with a soft clink. The sound was small, but it echoed in every ear, louder than engines, louder than threats. It was the sound of a line being drawn, and in that moment, every passenger knew this wasn't about a seat anymore. It was about truth. And truth had just taken its place in 12A. The plane sat idle on the runway, engines humming low like a predator waiting to pounce. The atmosphere inside the cabin was heavier than the steel walls surrounding it. No one touched their phones, no one rang for service. It was as if the air itself had frozen. The man in 12A sat calmly, legs crossed, his gaze fixed out the window where the horizon glowed orange with the last hints of dusk. That glow cast a halo over his silhouette, making him look less like a passenger and more like a statue carved from resilience. The captain lingered in the aisle. His hands were clasped behind his back, but his eyes betrayed the storm inside. He had faced turbulence, storms, even mechanical emergencies, but this, a quiet refusal from a single man, rattled him more deeply. The businessman, red-faced and restless, leaned across the aisle toward him. "Captain, you can't just let this go. What kind of example are you setting? This man is poisoning the atmosphere for everyone." The captain's jaw clenched. He wanted to respond, but the words refused to come. Something in him resisted. Perhaps it was that torn ticket on the armrest, or perhaps the simple way the man had said, "The truth doesn't get moved to the back of the plane." Meanwhile, whispers traveled like contraband. A teenage boy whispered to his mother, "Why don't they just let him sit there if it's his seat?" She shushed him quickly, fear in her eyes. But the question hung between them like smoke. The older gentleman near the front leaned back, arms folded, watching. He said nothing more, but his silence wasn't empty. It was loaded, like a weapon waiting for its moment. The flight attendant stood near the galley, trembling slightly. Her heart pounded every time her eyes drifted to the torn ticket. She had ripped it without hesitation earlier, so certain she was right. But now, as she replayed the moment, she realized the cruelty of her action. She wanted to apologize, to fix what she'd broken, but the businessman's glare pinned her down like a weight. The silence grew unbearable until the businessman barked again. "Captain, if you don't deal with him, I will call security myself." This time, the man in 12A finally turned his head. His eyes found the businessman's with a calm so unnerving it silenced the entire row. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low but clear. "You can call all the security you want. You can raise your voice, pound your fists, or tear more paper. But there's one thing you'll never control." He paused, letting the silence draw every ear closer. "The truth. And right now, everyone here sees it." A chill ran through the cabin. The businessman sneered, scanning the passengers, desperate for support. "You all see what's happening, don't you? He's manipulating you. But when his eyes met theirs, he saw something he hadn't expected: hesitation, doubt. A quiet rebellion forming behind lowered brows and tightened jaws. The passengers were no longer fully with him. A mother clutching her daughter's hand whispered, "He hasn't done anything wrong." Her voice was soft, but it cracked the air like lightning. The businessman's mouth opened, but no words came. His power was slipping, and he knew it. The captain cleared his throat, stepping closer to the man in 12A. "Sir, you're putting me in a difficult position. I'm responsible for the safety and order of this aircraft." The man looked up at him, his expression calm but firm. "And what's order without justice, Captain? What's safety if it comes at the cost of a man's dignity?" The captain's chest tightened. His hands trembled, ever so slightly. The words pierced deeper than turbulence, deeper than duty. For a long moment, nothing moved. The hum of the engines was the only sound. Then the man in 12A reached into his jacket pocket. The cabin gasped collectively. The businessman, even flinching back, half expecting something dangerous. But what emerged was only a small leather notebook, its edges worn from use. He flipped it open, tore out a single blank page, and carefully folded it into the shape of an airplane. His hands were steady, deliberate, almost ceremonial. When he finished, he set the paper plane gently on top of the torn boarding pass. The symbolism was unmistakable. Broken paper could still fly. The passengers stared. Some shifted uncomfortably, but others sat straighter, their eyes softening. It wasn't just paper, it was a statement. A quiet rebellion etched in folds. The captain stared at it too, his throat dry. He realized, painfully, that he was no longer in control of the cabin. Authority had shifted subtly, invisibly, but unmistakably, to the man who had said almost nothing and yet said everything. The businessman saw it too. His lips trembled with fury. He leaned closer, spitting his words like venom. "You think you're clever? You think these little tricks mean anything? You're nothing but a fraud sitting in a seat you don't deserve." The man in 12A didn't answer immediately. Instead, he tapped the folded paper plane once gently with his fingertip. Then he raised his eyes to the businessman, calm as ever. "You mistake silence for weakness. But silence, when it holds truth, weighs more than all your shouting." The words landed like stones in water, sending ripples across the cabin. Heads turned toward the businessman, not in agreement, but in judgment. His arrogance no longer inspired fear, it looked pathetic, desperate. The businessman sank back, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had lost something tonight. Not the argument, but the room. And as the man in 12A leaned back in his seat, folding his hands calmly in his lap, every passenger knew the sky wasn't the only thing carrying weight tonight. The silence inside this cabin carried more than thunder ever could. The engines roared louder, vibrating through the floor beneath the passengers' feet. The plane was moments from rolling forward, yet the cabin still sat in a tense standstill. No one had returned to idle chatter. No one dared order a drink. Every soul was still tethered to the silent storm surrounding 12A. The businessman tugged at his tie, sweat pooling at his temples. His chest heaved like a man who had just lost a battle he didn't understand. The fact that the other passengers were no longer nodding in his favor ate at him like rust. Across the aisle, the young mother leaned down to her daughter, her lips trembling as she whispered, "Never let anyone tell you where you don't belong." She thought she was speaking softly enough, but the words carried. 2 rows back, someone nodded. The ripple was spreading. The businessman heard it too. His head whipped around, his glare stabbing at anyone whose eyes dared to meet his. "You're all fools if you think this man isn't dangerous," he spat, his voice cracking. "He doesn't follow rules. He mocks authority. What happens when people like him run everything? Silence." No one answered. But silence now wasn't his weapon, it was 12A's. The man in 12A leaned forward slightly, his hands folded together, his voice calm enough to cut through the businessman's trembling. "I don't mock authority. I simply remind it that it must answer to truth." The captain, still standing in the aisle, stiffened at the words. He had trained his entire life to believe in hierarchy, in obedience, in command. Yet tonight, one passenger was dismantling all of it without shouting, without threatening, only by holding his ground. The flight attendant gripped the galley counter behind her, her knuckles pale. Her heart ached as she stared at the torn boarding pass on the man's armrest. She saw it in her mind again, the casual way she had ripped it, the businessman's approving smirk. Shame tightened around her throat like a rope. Finally, she stepped forward. Her voice wavered at first, but steadied with each word. "Captain, I was the one who tore his ticket." The entire cabin turned to her. "He showed it to me. He had the right seat. Her voice cracked. I let someone else's pressure decide for me. The businessman's face went red, his fury igniting. You don't know what you're saying. You're just trying to save yourself. But the attendant cut him off, louder this time, as if something inside her had finally snapped free. No, I know exactly what I'm saying. I saw the truth, and I destroyed it. That was my mistake. Gasps rose from the passengers. A murmur swept through the cabin like wind over tall grass. Heads turned, eyes locked on the businessman now, not the man in 12A. The shift was undeniable. The captain's throat tightened. He looked at the attendant, then at the man in 12A, then at the passengers watching him expectantly. For the first time in years, he questioned whether authority came from the stripes on his shoulder or from the courage to admit when wrong was wrong. The businessman scrambled for control. He stood abruptly, his voice rising like a siren. Don't. You all see? This is manipulation. He's brainwashing you. His arms flailed, his desperation painted across every frantic gesture. The man in 12A didn't flinch. Instead, he reached calmly into his jacket again, pulling out the same small notebook. He flipped it open, not to a blank page this time, but to one filled with writing. The paper was creased, the ink smudged, but the words were deliberate. He held it up, not to show, but to read aloud. His voice was soft, steady, carrying to the farthest rows. The measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort, but where he stands in times of challenge. The cabin hushed, hanging on the sentence. The businessman sneered. And what's that supposed to be? Another trick? The man closed the notebook gently, looking straight into his eyes. It's not a trick. It's a truth, and it wasn't written by me. He paused. It was written by Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. The businessman's smirk faltered. The name itself carried a weight he couldn't dismiss. Not here, not now. The passengers shifted again, some visibly moved, others closing their eyes as if in silent reflection. The older gentleman at the front finally spoke, his voice deep and firm. I lived through those days. I remember what it felt like to be told to sit in the back. And I remember what it felt like when men like him stood up and said no more. He gestured toward 12A. And I'll tell you all this, he's right. Silence, when it holds truth, is stronger than any man's shouting. A hush swept the room, but it wasn't the tense hush of before. It was reverent, heavy, powerful. The businessman stumbled back into his seat, shaking his head furiously. But the strength in his posture was gone. The authority he once carried had crumbled in the face of quiet conviction. The captain inhaled slowly, his chest heavy, his mind torn. He looked at the man in 12A, then at his crew, then at the passengers who had placed their faith not in him, but in a man who had refused to move. And deep down, though he hated to admit it, the captain knew, tonight, he was no longer the leader of this cabin. The engines roared again as the plane began to inch forward. But it wasn't just the sky they were lifting toward, it was something greater. Something unseen. The whispers in the cabin, once cautious, now carried a rhythm. A quiet chorus of truth, rising like dawn. The plane rolled slowly down the tarmac, the vibrations trembling through the cabin floor. Yet despite the engines building toward liftoff, no one's mind was on the journey ahead. Their eyes remained locked on the quiet man in seat 12A, and the businessman who had begun to unravel before them. The businessman leaned forward, his jaw tight, his fists clenched so hard his knuckles turned white. He searched the faces around him for allies, for even one nod of agreement, but the silence cut deeper than any rejection. He had lost the cabin. His voice cracked as he tried again. Do you people really think this? This nobody should be allowed to defy authority like this? What kind of society do you want, where rules mean nothing? The man in 1-2A shifted slightly, his movements measured, deliberate. He did not raise his voice, he did not strike with anger. Instead, he let his calm spill into the air like water, into parched soil. Rules built on lies are not rules, he said quietly. They are cages. The businessman's lips trembled. His eyes darted to the captain, searching for support. Captain, you see what's happening here, don't you? He's trying to undermine you. He's poisoning your passengers. But the captain wasn't. Meeting his gaze, his eyes were fixed instead on the torn boarding pass resting on the armrest of 1-2A, the paper. Once dismissed, now burned in his mind as a symbol of something much larger, the ease with which truth could be destroyed when convenience demanded it. The flight attendant took a deep breath. Her chest rose and fell as if she were gathering every ounce of courage left inside her. Then she spoke, loud enough for all to hear. He's not poisoning anyone, she said firmly. He's reminding us who we are. Heads turned. The cabin filled with murmurs, small ripples of approval. Some passengers sat taller. Others exchanged glances that carried unspoken agreement. The businessman slammed his palm against the tray table. You're all blind. You're letting him manipulate you because he's playing the victim. That's what people like him always do. Enough. The word cut through the air like a blade. It hadn't come from 1-2A. It hadn't come from the captain or the attendant. It came from the elderly gentleman at the front, his cane resting against his knee. His voice, though steady with age, carried the weight of someone who had lived through too many battles of dignity versus arrogance. I've heard your kind of talk before. The old man continued, his eyes locked on the businessman. Different decade, different setting, but the same poison. And every time, men like him, he gestured toward 1-2A, stood quietly, carried dignity, and showed the world how hollow your noise really is. The businessman froze, as if struck. For the first time, his mouth opened but no words came. Out. The cabin fell utterly silent again. All eyes turned to 1-2A, waiting for his next move. The man inhaled deeply, then reached into his jacket pocket once more. But this time, instead of pulling out the small notebook, he slid free a slim, weathered envelope. He placed it gently on the tray table, his fingers lingering on it for a moment, as though it held not just paper, but the weight of generations. He looked at the captain. Do you know why I didn't stand when he told me to? The captain's throat tightened. Why? The man's gaze swept across the cabin, each passenger feeling the gravity of his eyes. Because the seat he tried to take from me wasn't just a seat. It was a place my father never got to sit. A hush deeper than before cloaked the cabin. He opened the envelope carefully, pulling out a folded photograph, worn, edges frayed, colors faded with time. He held it up, his hand steady. It showed a black man in a suit from decades past, standing at the base of an old courthouse, a whites-only sign nailed above the door. This was my father, 1-2A said softly. A man who built houses with his hands but was told he could never build a life in certain neighborhoods. A man who paid taxes but was told his vote was worth less. A man who was forced to ride in the back of buses, who was told where he didn't belong. He died with his dignity intact, but he never got to sit where I'm sitting now. The attendant covered her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. The old man at the front wiped his glasses, his hands trembling. Even the captain's chest felt heavier, as if the weight of history had been placed directly into his lap. The businessman tried to scoff, but his voice cracked, betraying his weakness. That's just a sob story. It doesn't prove anything. But no one was listening to him anymore. The man in 1-2 placed the photo back into the envelope and closed it with care, his fingers pressing against it as though sealing a promise. Then he looked at the passengers once more, his voice quieter than ever, yet undeniable. I didn't stay in this seat for me. I stayed for him. And for every other father, mother, son, or daughter who's told to move when they had every right to stay. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of breathless awe, of shame, of recognition, of a rising tide of respect. The captain swallowed hard, his eyes burning. Authority no longer weighed on his shoulders the same way. It had shifted, redefined itself. The businessman slumped back, his face pale, his fury hollow. His voice had been stolen not by force, not by volume, but by truth. The plane tilted forward. As it reached the runway, the engines readying for takeoff. But inside the cabin, it felt as though they had already lifted into a higher sky. One far beyond the clouds. The engines roared louder, the plane surging down the runway, but within the cabin, time seemed suspended. Passengers weren't feeling the acceleration. They were feeling the weight of the silence after the man in 12A's revelation. Every heartbeat seemed amplified, every breath an echo. The businessman shifted in his seat. His shirt clung damply to his back, his tie hung loose, his once polished appearance collapsing. But his pride, though battered, still clawed desperately for air. He pushed himself up from his seat, his hand gripping the top of another passenger's headrest for balance. His voice came ragged, broken but loud. "You're all fools," he spat, his eyes darting wildly from row to row. "You sit there, letting this man lecture you with his sob story. You think dignity matters more than power, more than control? The world doesn't care about his father or mine or yours. The world respects one thing: authority." His words bounced against the walls of the cabin, but they no longer carried weight. Instead, they sounded like the brittle cracking of something breaking apart. The captain rose slowly from his seat at the front of the cabin, his uniform still crisp, but his face transformed. For the first time, there was no distance in his eyes. He was not the unmovable authority figure passengers had met before. He was simply a man standing at the edge of truth. Authority without justice isn't strength, the captain said, his voice calm but firm. It's weakness wearing a uniform. Gasps scattered softly through the cabin. The passengers turned from the businessman to the captain, as though watching tectonic plates shift beneath them. The businessman's face flushed crimson. "Don't you dare lecture me," he shouted. "You're the captain. You should know better than anyone that order is everything." But the flight attendant stepped forward, her voice carrying like an unexpected trumpet. "Order at the cost of truth is just silence, and silence is how injustice survives." Her hands trembled as she spoke, but her eyes did not waver. For the first time since boarding, she felt free. The businessman laughed, but it was hollow, sharp, desperate. "Listen to her," he sneered. "A glorified waitress thinks she knows better than men who actually built this system. You're all letting emotions run the show. Pathetic." That was when the young man across the aisle, quiet until now, stood up. His sneakers squeaked softly on the floor as he turned to face the businessman. His voice wasn't loud, but it struck with the sharpness of truth. "I'm studying law," he said. "And the first thing I learned is that a system built on lies eventually collapses under its own weight. That's what's happening right now. You're not fighting for rules. You're fighting for yourself." The businessman's head snapped toward him, but before he could reply, another voice joined, this time from behind. A woman clutching a Bible in her lap whispered, "Amen." The words spread like fire through the rows. A nod here, a murmur there. The passengers weren't shouting. They didn't need to. Their quiet agreement was louder than the businessman's rage. The plane lifted from the runway, the engines thundering as they cut through the sky. But inside, the businessman was plummeting. His voice cracked as he tried one final swing. "You'll regret this, all of you. You think this man is your hero? He's no one. When we land, I'll make sure he pays. I'll sit down." The command came sharp, cold, and undeniable. It wasn't the captain this time. It wasn't even the man in 1-2A. It was the elderly gentleman at the front, his cane now pressed firmly against the floor. "You've taken enough from this flight," the old man said, his voice shaking but strong. "Sit down." The businessman's mouth opened, but no words came. His eyes darted around the cabin, seeking an ally, but every passenger avoided his gaze, even those who earlier sat in uneasy. Silence now stared at him with quiet defiance. At last, defeated, he slumped into his seat. His chest heaved, his head fell into his hands, and for the first time since the plane left the gate, he was small. The man in 12A hadn't moved throughout the entire storm. His calm was not victory, it was truth sitting still, refusing to bend. Now, as the passengers around him slowly exhaled, as tension melted from shoulders and eyes softened, he finally spoke again. "You see?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Noise always collapses under silence, because silence isn't weakness. It's waiting for the right word." The captain lowered his gaze, ashamed yet relieved. The attendant looked at him, her tears finally falling, but with them came release. The businessman stayed hunched, his shoulders caving inward, his arrogance stripped away like a snake shedding skin. As the plane ascended higher into the night sky, the passengers carried something more than luggage. They carried the memory of what had happened in that cabin. They carried the image of dignity defeating arrogance, not with fists, not with power, but with truth. And though the engines drowned the world outside, inside there was only the hum of justice, quiet, steady, undeniable. The plane hummed steadily through the night sky, stars flickering faintly beyond the windows. Yet no one inside was watching the horizon. Every gaze was turned inward. Every heart weighed heavy with what had unfolded thousands of feet above the earth. The businessman remained slumped in his seat, his head pressed into his hands. The arrogance that once filled the cabin like smoke had burned itself out, leaving only the acrid scent of desperation clinging to him. His chest rose and fell in sharp, uneven breaths. No one pitied him, not anymore. The captain stood near the aisle, his face pale but resolved. For years he had been a guardian of silence, mistaking obedience for duty. Now stripped of that shield, he looked both smaller and somehow more human. The flight attendant, her voice still echoing from her brave defiance, sat quietly at the front, her hands clasped, her tears dried into faint tracks across her cheeks. Yet her shoulders, once bent under the weight of servitude, now sat straighter. She carried herself not as an attendant, but as a witness who refused to erase the truth. And at the center of it all sat the man in 12A, calm, still, his eyes fixed on the stars outside. His silence was no longer an absence, it was the undeniable presence of someone who had spoken when it mattered most. The cabin felt like a courtroom in the sky. The jury, every passenger, the defendant, the system of arrogance and silence that had kept them obedient for too long. And the verdict was still being written. A child's voice broke the stillness. From 3 rows back, the little girl who had watched everything unfold leaned toward her mother and whispered, not quietly enough, "Mommy." The man in 12, it looks like a king. The mother shushed her gently, but her own eyes shimmered with tears. Around them, passengers exchanged glances, not mocking, not dismissive. They felt the same. Dignity had a crown of its own, and they had seen it placed without ceremony. The businessman lifted his head, his face blotched red, his eyes wild. His voice cracked, torn between rage and exhaustion. "You think this ends here?" he rasped. "You think the world will care what happened on a plane, in the dark, with no cameras? When we land, You'll all go back to your little lives and nothing will change. Men like me will always win." But his words no longer carried the sting of authority. They fell flat, like ashes scattered in the wind. The young law student stood again, his voice sharper now, more certain than before. "No," he said. "Men like you win because the rest of us stay quiet. Tonight, we didn't." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the rows. Quiet nods, firm stares. No applause, no cheers. Just a silent uprising that could not be undone. The captain, moved by something deeper than fear, spoke at last. "When we land, I'll write my report. And this time, it won't be a lie." Gasps filled the cabin. Even the businessman froze. A captain admitting such a thing was almost unthinkable. But the words hung there, undeniable, carried not just by one man, but by everyone who had watched in silence for too long. The man in 1-2-A finally turned, his eyes sweeping the cabin. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. His words came soft, steady. "Landing isn't the end of a flight. It's just the beginning of the journey that follows." The engine shifted pitch. As the announcement came, "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent shortly. Please fasten your seatbelts." But seatbelts or not, no one in that cabin would ever travel the same way again. The city lights glittered beneath them, growing brighter as the plane descended. The businessman muttered bitterly under his breath, his world collapsing inward. The attendant's trembling hand steadied as she poured water for a child. The captain's eyes stared unblinking at the approaching runway, but his shoulders no longer bore the same weight. And the man in 1-2-A still, silent, looked out the window as though he had seen this all before, as though he had always known the plane carried more than passengers. It carried a truth waiting to be spoken. The landing gear unfolded with a thud, the wheels braced for earth. Passengers held their breath, not from fear of the ground, but from awe of what had been revealed above it. The plane touched down. A gentle jolt, a rolling thunder across the runway. Applause usually followed landings, but not this time. This time, the silence itself was applause. As the plane slowed, the businessman jolted upright, his voice sharp with one last attempt. "You'll all regret crossing me," he shouted. "I'll bury this story before it ever leaves this cabin." The man in 1-2 arose slowly, his posture calm, his gaze unshaken. He didn't speak loudly, but his words silenced every corner of the plane. Stories don't stay buried. Not when they're written on every heart that heard them. The businessman froze, his face draining of color. Around him, passengers exchanged knowing looks. The verdict was sealed not by law, not by force, but by truth. The engines quieted. The plane eased to its gate and the seatbelt sign chimed off. Passengers stood, gathering bags, but their eyes lingered on one another. Something unspoken had bound them together. The flight attendant stood near the door, greeting each passenger as they exited. This time, her voice wasn't rehearsed, it was real, trembling with strength. The captain stood beside her, no longer just a uniform, but a man facing his own reflection. The businessman stormed off first. Shoving past others, his power diminished to nothing but noise. No one moved to follow him. The man in 1-2-A waited until the very end. As he stepped into the aisle, passengers parted without being asked. He didn't wear a crown. He didn't need one. His silence had spoken louder than any thrown. At the exit, the flight attendant's eyes met his. She whispered, "Thank you." He paused, then said the only words that mattered, "Don't thank me. Carry it." And with that, he stepped into the terminal, disappearing into the crowd, leaving behind a plane full of passengers who would never again confuse silence with weakness. For in the sky that night, arrogance had fallen, dignity had risen, and the truth had landed.